Okay, so Shavua Tov, everyone. We're in Shmuel Aleph, and I have a question that needs answering that we spoke about, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through that question before we go into the Psukim. And it was a question that Michael Kraus asked last week. Let's see if he can even remember what the question was. No, he can't remember the question. Okay. Does anybody remember the question? Well, okay, well, it's a good job I remembered the question because it's quite an interesting answer. So the question that you asked, I think it was you that asked it, Michael, was why the numbers were different with Yehuda, where they added the Bane Israel and Yehuda. Do you remember the question now? Okay, let's go to the Psukim and have a look at what the question was. Let's put you on the screen with the text. Chapter 11. There it is, chapter 11. Let's go from verse 6, Leo. Let me just, first of all, hang on a second. I need to mute you all. First of all, how am I going to do that now? Mute everyone. Have to stop sharing for that for 1 second. Mute all. Yes. Right. So let's go back again. There we go. Chapter 11, verse 6, Leon, please.
The Spirit of God passed over Saul when he heard these things, and he became very angry.
Oh, Leon's frozen. Is he going to unfreeze?
You did say it was cold.
Yes, it's well, okay, so we'll carry on then. I'll read on until Leon unfreezes. And he took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout the entire border of Israel in the hand of the messengers, saying, whosoever does not go forth after Saul and after Samuel, so shall be done to his oxen. And a fear from the Lord fell upon the people, and they went forth as one man. We discussed that last week. And he counted them in Bezek, and the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Yehuda were 30,000. And Michael Kraus asked the question last week. Was you, wasn't it, Michael? Yes. Michael Kraus asked a very good question. Why are the men of Yehuda counted separately from the men of Israel, from the Bane Israel? Surely Yehuda was part of Bane Israel. And it turns out that actually that's a very, very good question, because we all know, don't we, that after the death of Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, the kingdom split into two. Yeah, we had the southern kingdom of Judah, which consisted of the tribes of Yehuda and Binyamin. Here's Leon's come back to us now. Let's just wait for Leon to come back. There you are. Leon, you're back with us. That's good. Okay. So yeah, after the death of King Solomon, the kingdom split into the southern kingdom of Judah, consisting of the tribes of Yehuda and Binyamin, and the other 10 tribes. The other 10 tribes, with the exception of Levi. He's the 13th tribe, of course. Levi didn't have any particular territory that was given to him. He had 48 cities spread around the country. And the 10 tribes became known as the Kingdom of Israel. Very confusing for us, really, which is why, by the way, there was a discussion when the modern state of Israel was established. Before it was established, there was a discussion as to what it was going to be called, whether it was going to be called Judea, whether it was going to be called Israel. Of course, it was called Israel. But it's confusing for those people who know the Tanakh, the history in Tanakh, because, of course, the name Israel was connected with the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes who were not faithful to God and the temple in Jerusalem, and they were the first to be exiled by the attacking Assyrians, the Babylonians. They were the ones that were exiled first, and then of course they became the 10 lost tribes, some of whom we are now seeing back in the fold. But where we came from, the Jews, why are we called Jews? We're called Jews, we're called Yehudim, because we were from the kingdom of Yehuda, of Judea, which was in the south. Now, all that split took place after the death of King Solomon. King Solomon was the 3rd king of Israel. Shaul was the 1st. We're talking about him in our chapter here. David was the 2nd, and Shlomo was the 3rd. So the split had not yet occurred at this time that this chapter is referring to. However, if you look carefully in Tanakh, even before the split, after the death of King Solomon, even before that, the signs that there was a split community were already there, and this is one of them. This is one of the signs. Chapter 11, verse 8 here, he counted them in Bezek, and the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah were 30,000. The question that Michael asked is a very pertinent question, because it's showing us that there actually was already a split. And there are other places as well where we will see this. If you have a look in chapter 17 of Shmuel Aleph, which I've put on the screen for you now, this is at the time of the story of David and Goliath. Okay, look at what it says here, chapter 17. Leon, if you've got it there with you, verse. Well, let's just have a look at the story. We all know the story, but let's have a look at the story from verse 48 onwards in chapter 17.
It happened that when the Philistine arose and moved closer towards David, that David hurried and ran to the line towards the Philistine. David stretched his hand into the sack. He took a stone from there and slung it, and struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone penetrated his forehead, and he fell upon his face upon the ground. Thus David overpowered the Philistine with the slingshot and stone. He smote the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in David's hand. David ran and stood by the Philistine. He took Goliath's sword and drew it from its sheath, having already killed him, and he cut off his head with it. The Philistines saw that their hero was dead, and they ran away. The men of Israel and Judah rose up and shouted exultantly and pursued the Philistines up to the approach to the valley and to the gates of Ekron. Philistine corpses were strewn along the Sha'araim road until Gath and Ekron.
Okay, so there we are. Verse 52, I wanted to just say the previous verses because it's such a great story that we all know. Never miss an opportunity to read that story of David and Goliath. Probably one of the most famous stories in the whole of Tanakh that everybody knows about, not just Jews. And then afterwards, look at what it says. Vayakumu anshe Yisrael v'Yehuda. Again, the same question that Michael could ask here. Why is there a distinction? Well, there's a distinction because already before even David has become king, i.e. in the time of Shaul, there is already the beginnings of a split between Israel and Judah. Judah is separated from Israel. And just to emphasize the point further, we'll go on to the next chapter. Why was David so loved? Because he had done what he did to Goliath, and he was David Melech Israel, Melech the whole of Israel. David was the king of all of Israel. But look at verse 16 in chapter 18 there. I've highlighted it on the screen. Leon, please.
The agents came, and behold, the mannequins were in the bed. And
where are you? Hang on a sec, Leon. I'm in chapter 18.
I turned over 2 pages by mistake. Verse what?
Chapter 18, verse 16.
16. All of Israel and Judah loved David, for he came and went before them.
There you go. All of Israel and Judah. Again, another example of this idea that Yehuda and Israel are not necessarily one and the same thing. So, and in fact, if you look at Sefer Shmuel Bet in chapter 2, so Shmuel Bet chapter 2, you can see actually that for a short period of time after Saul dies, we'll get to this eventually, a short period of time after Saul dies, the monarchy actually does split. You see that you have David. King David is initially the king over Yehuda alone, and the Israel has their own king. Without going to Shmuel Bet chapter 2, does anybody remember the name of the king, the rival king to David, who took over after Shaul's death for a short period of time? Anybody know? Yes, Paul.
Ishbosheth.
Very good. Excellent. Ishbosheth. There we are. Shmuel Bet chapter 2. Let's just see where we should read from. Go from chapter verse 8, please. Leon, where are you? He disappeared again. Oh, he's disappeared again. I think we just got to let him back in. Okay, so have a look over here. Shmuel Bet. Shmuel Bet. Yeah, there you are, Leon. Shmuel Bet, chapter 2, verse 8. You're muted, Leon.
Unmute, yes. Now Abner, son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him across to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead, over the Asherite, over Jezreel, over Ephraim, over Benjamin, and over all of Israel. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he reigned over Israel, and he reigned for 2 years.
Okay, keep going.
However, the house of Judah was loyal to David. The number of days that David was king over the house of Judah in Hebron was 7 years and 6 months.
Okay, so you see there very clearly that there was a split between Yehuda and Israel even before the final split. So you could argue, and it would be absolutely correct, I think, that the split of the kingdom after the death of King Solomon was actually only the end process of something which had been going on for many, many years before. If you like, the writing was on the wall long before the actual final split made. David managed to unite the two sides, as it were, the two parts of the kingdom. After this here, David becomes the king of all of Israel, David Melech Israel. And Shlomo manages to keep that going, although not particularly successfully, if we're honest. And then as soon as Shlomo dies, that's it. The kingdom splits for good, and it never comes back again together. So the answer to your question, Michael, let's go back to our chapter here. The answer to your question, Michael, is that this is the first indication, at least in Sefer Shmuel, that there is this split in the country between Yehuda and the rest of Yisrael. Now it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you go back in time to the original Yehuda, who was the leader of the gang of his brothers, he was the leader of the brothers. He wasn't the firstborn, that was Reuven, and he wasn't Yaakov's choice either, that as firstborn, because that was Yosef. He got the Pishnayim, he got the double portion. But Yehuda became the de facto leader of the people, of the brothers. He was the one that they all listened to when he said, let's throw Joseph in the pit. He was the one that stepped forward in Egypt when faced with the problem of Binyamin and the stolen goblet. Yehuda was the leader. But if you look in the Torah itself, you will see that there was a time when Yehuda split away from his brothers, even at that time, and that is at the time when he of the story of Tamar. You remember the story of Tamar, when Yehuda goes off and has relations with his daughter-in-law, who he thinks is a prostitute, etc. There's a funny business going on there, apart from the obvious funny business, in that this story interrupts the Yosef story. We see in the parsha, I haven't got it up on the screen, but we see it must be, I guess, in Parshat. It must be in Parshat Vayeshev, I'm guessing. Is it, David? In Parshat Vayeshev?
Yeah, sure is.
Yeah, can you find me the chapter so I can get it up on the screen while I'm talking? You'll see that in Parshat Vayeshev, we start with the story of Joseph, and we interrupt the story of Joseph to tell the story of Yehuda and Tamar right in the middle. It doesn't make sense. When you're reading the story, it's almost goes off on a subplot, which has nothing to do with the Yosef story.
Chapter 38.
Chapter 38 of Bereshit. Thank you. Let's get it up on the screen. Bereshit, chapter 38. There we go. So here we go. And this is, well, let's just go back to chapter 37. At the end of chapter 37, we'll see what we were talking about. The end of chapter 37, here we go. And the Midianites sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, Pharaoh's chamberlain, chief of the slaughterers. Joseph has been sold in Egypt. And then we'd expect the next chapter to tell us what happened to Joseph. But it doesn't. It interrupts the story to tell us about the story of Yehuda. And the reason I wanted to show it you on the screen is because of verse 1 in chapter 38. Leon, he's frozen again. Leon's having real trouble. So it says in verse 1 of chapter 38, Vayehi ba'etahi, and it was at that time, Vayered Yehuda me'et echav. Now, the literal translation is Judah went down from his brothers. And it's a shame that Leon's frozen, because I would like to know what the Art Scroll translation of that is. I don't think I've got an art. Oh, no, I haven't got an Art Scroll.
I'm back again.
Oh,
Johnny.
you're back.
I'm sorry about this.
How does the Art Scroll translate chapter 38, verse 1 of Bereshit, please?
It was at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned away towards an Adulamite man whose name was Hira.
Okay, so the Steinsaltz, the Art Scroll says Judah went down from his brothers, and that you would think, just reading that, would be a geographical thing, because he went down to further south. And I'm just having a look to see what the Steinsaltz translation is. The Steinsaltz translation says it was at that time Judah descended from his brothers. And in his little notes, it says, Judah now left the presence of his brothers to establish his own private business. Judah reached Adullam, a city in the south of Judea. The Art Scroll indicates that it just says he went down from his brothers. Rav Steinsaltz stresses and emphasizes the idea that he has split from his brothers. He says, I'll read it again. In any case, Judah now left the presence of his brothers to establish his own private business. So Judah has now left his brothers, and he has gone to this Adulamite man called Hira. So Judah is now has made himself separate. Now, what's interesting is the translation on the screen here, which is the Chabad website, uses the word demoted by his brothers. Vayered, he went down, i.e., he went down in their estimation. And the reason that the translation here indicates this is because of where it's placed chronologically. As I said before, chapter 37 ends with the sale of Joseph to Potiphar. And after this story of Judah and Tamar, we go back to it. And the reason that the Mefarshim say that Yehuda was demoted by his brothers, was he lost face, was because they all had some regret. After they had sold Joseph, the brothers had regret that they'd done it. And they blamed Yehuda. And they said to Yehuda, you're the leader of the gang. It was your idea. If you'd have said, let's not do it, we would have listened to you. And they fell out with Yehuda. And Yehuda was demoted in their eyes, as it were. He was no longer considered to be, by the brothers at this point, the leader of the gang, as it were. However, we do see in Parshat Vayigash that it is Yehuda that steps up to the plate when Binyamin is looking like he's in trouble, having theoretically at least, or apparently, stolen the goblet. So he does actually step up to the plate again. But at this point, Yehuda is demoted by his brothers. But either way, whether you think of this word Vayered to mean he went down in their estimation, or whether you take the Steinsaltz translation that he chose to have his own private business, he went away from his brothers, or you take the Art Scroll, he went south and geographically went down, i.e. south from his brothers. It's clear that even at this point, there's a separation here between Yehuda and the rest of his brothers. And it's this separation which sows the seeds of the eventual split in the people after the death of Shlomo. And our chapter and Michael's question about the numbers here in chapter 11 of Shmuel Aleph, which we've got back on the screen now, is effectively part of this process of Yehuda and Israel not being 100% together. And it seems that the only time that they really were firmly together was during the time of King David, after he had united the kingdom. Initially, as we said before, King David was the king of Yehuda in Hebron for 7 years. And then he moved to Jerusalem, the capital to Jerusalem, to be king over all of Israel, David Melech Israel. During that time of David's reign and during the reign of Shlomo, the kingdoms were together. But clearly, even during that time, there were undertones of split, because the split came, as we eventually will learn, the split came very, very rapidly after the death of Shlomo. And it seems that it was only the personalities of David and Shlomo who were able to keep the people together. And it's a sad reflection, isn't it, I'm afraid, on us as a people, historically, that right from the start, we've never been able to really get on with one another as well as we ought to have done. Brothers fighting, sibling rivalry, ending up with 10 lost tribes and the tragedy of that. Yes, David, I can feel a comment coming along.
Going back to Michael's original question, there's another occasion a few chapters on with the story of Shaul fighting against Amalek, where he numbers Yehuda separately when he's counting or getting the troops together. If you have a look in chapter 15, verse 4 of Shmuel Aleph. And the suggestion brought by Art Scroll here is a more positive spin, in that Shaul recognizes both there and in our chapter that he's in effect a usurper coming from Shevet Binyamin, and therefore he wants to give deference to Yehuda that was promised Malchut by Yaakov before he dies.
Okay, let's have a look at that. Chapter 15, verse 4, there we go. As you said, are you with us, Leon?
Yes, yes.
Okay, verse 4 of chapter 15.
Saul had all the people summoned, and he counted them through lambs, 200,000 infantrymen, and the men of Judah were 10,000.
Okay, there you go. That's interesting. Now I'm just looking at the the ratios here. We had 30,000 and 3,000, didn't we, in our chapter? Is that right? 1 in 10. Is that right? I think it was.
30,000.
I think it was 300,000 and 30,000, I thought.
300,000 and 30,000. And this was 200,000 and 10,000. So you'd expect 20,000. So that the ratio's gone down. Don't know if that's relevant, but the ratio of Judah to the rest of the people has gone down by the time we get to chapter 15. It's gone down by half, because you'd 200,000, you'd expect 20,000 if you're sticking with the same ratio. Anyway, that's a very interesting. So thank you for that question, Michael. That shows us, I think, that the cracks were there well before the end of King Shlomo. Right, let's go on where we left off last week.
So one more response to Michael's question. Controversially, traditional authorship of Sefer Shmuel is ascribed to Shmuel himself. Modern Bible commentators assume it's written much later after the division of the kingdom, probably at the time of the Churban Bayit Rishon, and therefore it's reflected by the author, the split between Yehuda and Israel.
Do the Bible critics actually bring that as a proof of their later authorship, or as a result of the later authorship?
No, as a proof of the later authorship.
Right. Okay. Well, what do we think about that, everyone?
As I said, it's controversial.
Yeah, I'm not so sure, really. So what they would be saying is that there wasn't a split at this time, and they only put these figures in because, well, I think I prefer my explanation.
So do I.
Oh, good. All right. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you for that. Right, let's carry on. We just remind ourselves of the story. Nachash, the king of Ammon, has threatened to attack Yavesh Gilad. Yavesh Gilad sent messengers over the river to Givat Shaul to ask for help. Shaul basically forced everybody to go out and support Yavesh Gilad. They probably didn't want to because Yavesh Gilad had not been their favorite folk. But anyway, they did. And they had 300,000 and 30,000 from Judah, as we've just said. And let's see, this is where we got to. Verse 11. Oh, verse 10. Let's go from verse 10.
So the people of Yavesh said to Nachash, "Tomorrow we will go forth to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good in your eyes." It was on the next day that Saul set the people into 3 companies, and they entered the camp of the Ammonites at the approach of dawn, and they struck down Ammon by the time the day became hot. There were survivors, but they scattered. There did not remain of them 2 men together.
Okay, let's just stop there. Let's stop there. So this is the strange military tactics that or military ideas that we were talking about last week. The Nachash said to Yavesh Gilad, "We're going to attack you, and if you want," and they said, "Okay, don't attack us." They said, "All right, we won't attack you as long as you gouge out your eyes." And they said, "Well, give us a chance to try and find some support." And amazingly, Nachash said, "Okay, you've got a week," and they went and found their support. Now, I'm glad Philip's with us because he's our military strategist. So, what's going on here, Philip? The people said to Nachash, "Don't attack today. Tomorrow we will come." And you can do whatever you want with us tomorrow. And so have a look at verse 11, Philip, and tell us what is going on here militarily.
It could be that they asked for a day's respite because of logistics. They were bringing up supplies. And the Ammonites were stupid to accept it. But if they did, then they were in big trouble because an army marches also on its stomach. Not only logistics, but on its stomach also. They had to bring up supplies, and that day of respite allowed them to.
Okay, very good, Philip. Very good. I think that's probably more or less what happened here. What happened was that Shaul had the it wasn't very far. I showed you on the map last week. It's about 18 to 20.
Johnny, can I just tell you something? In the Yom Kippur War, the fact that the Syrians, for some reason, stopped their advance on the Golan Heights was the reason that Israel was able to bring up its reserves and and that they'd been supplied, and then they hit the Syrians very hard. It's the same thing.
Yeah. So what happened here? What happened here was that Shaul did something which apparently was unusual, and he had them marching into position during the night. That's why it stresses that vayavo b'toch hamachaneh b'ashmoret haboker. They came into the camp right at the beginning of the day at dawn. They weren't expecting that. It seems that that time, at least, armies did not go on the move at night. Presumably, they didn't have the facilities to see their way through and what have you. It seems that was what caught them by surprise. They weren't expecting the army to attack them at dawn. What they were expecting was that they would bring their reservists and their troops and their support during the day, and then they'd have a battle. But Shaul apparently did something which was unusual at that time, which was to have them marching during the night and to be in position ready to attack first thing in the morning. And it wasn't very far. I showed you on the map last week. They were at Bezek, which is about 18 to 20 miles only from Yavesh Gilad. So it wasn't very far. So they were able to be in position. And as Philip said, the Ammonites, I think, were just basically overconfident. They didn't expect to have this kind of resistance. They were overconfident. They had, according to the explanations that we went through last week and the week before, they had already gone through most of Reuven, Gad, Manasseh, half of Manasseh, and they were approaching Yavesh Gilead, which was on the border, was close to the River Jordan. So they've already had tremendous success in their battles. They're not expecting resistance from Yavesh Gilad, which was a particularly small number of people. We know from what we said before, there were only 7,000 of them. Number two, they were not popular with the rest of Israel, so they didn't expect them to be supported by Israel. And they were just overconfident. Shaul, on the other hand, managed to put together this big force of 330,000 soldiers, which it wasn't, by the way, because 330,000 soldiers in 24 hours from, or even in a week, where there is no motorized transport, is absolutely impossible. So those figures of 300,000 and 30,000 are not to be taken literally. Philip, how many soldiers are there in the current IDF? Please. You're muted, Philip. Unmute. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm okay now. Approximately in the standing army, about 140,000, I think, and with the reservists, they come to about 650,000. Okay. About 10% of the Jewish population.
Right. So you've got.
But Israel has never, even in the worst of its wars, which was probably the Yom Kippur War, has never mobilized all its reserves. Never.
Right. So on Philip's figures, which are probably right, you've got in the current army 140,000 in the standing army, let's say. So these figures of 330,000, you're talking double the current standing army of Israel in a week with no transport in one place. Impossible. So these figures are not to be taken literally. And I think that's important to say. We've been through the various problems with figures in the past, but these numbers cannot be right. and cannot be meant to be taken literally because it just doesn't make any sense. However, they mean a big number, right? 300,000 is a lot. So they had, relatively speaking, a lot of soldiers, and the Ammonites were taken by surprise, and they were overconfident, and they were struck ad chomayom. So until the heat of the day, they carried on a battle from dawn, and then they ran away. There's a word that you are all familiar with, by the way. Let's do a little bit of our usual etymology. Let's have a look here. Vayehi hanisharim, and it was those who were remaining. Vayafutsu, and they were scattered. Where have you heard that word before? You all know that word. Vayafutsu. Where have you heard that word before?
When you open the ark.
Yes, that's right. When you open the ark, Vayafutsu oyevecha, your enemies will be scattered. Or were scattered. Your enemies will be scattered. So this is an example of the of what we're talking about there when we open the ark, and they will flee from before you. This is what happened. Vayafutsu, the Ammonites scattered. Lo nisharu ba'em shnaim yachad. They were so scattered that there weren't two of them together. They all run away in different directions. And let's see what happened as a result of this tremendous victory that Shaul engineered. We see here, verse 12.
The people then said to Samuel, "Who is it that said, 'Will Saul reign over us? Give the men over, and we will put them to death.'"
Let's stop there for 1 second. What are they referring to here? Who are these people referring to? These people said to Samuel, "Whoever said Shaul will reign over us?" ? In other words, him. Give over these people, and we will put them to death. Who are they talking about?
The people in the earlier chapter didn't recognize his coronation.
Yes, exactly that. Let's have a look at the previous chapter, chapter 10, right at the end of chapter 10. There it is on the screen for you. Verse 27, Leon.
But base men said, "How can this person save us?" They ridiculed him and did not bring him a tribute, but he remained mute.
Okay, so there you go. Those people said, "No, we're not having him, he's useless." And so now in our chapter, the people are saying, well, why did they want to put those people to death, by the way?
Almost like treason.
Yes, it was exactly treason. It was mardut b'malchut. It was a rebellion. It was treason. And the halacha is that somebody who is mored b'malchut is chayav mita. He is liable to the death penalty. So the people wanted to put these people to death because now, of course, now that Shaul has delivered this stunning victory, everybody's on his side. And so they want to treat those people who did not accept Shaul as king. They want to treat them as traitors and put them to death. Verse 13.
But Saul said to them, "Let no man be put to death this day, for today Hashem has wrought salvation in Israel."
Okay, let's stop there. So what? Hashem has wrought deliverance in Israel. No man shall be put to death. So what? They did treason. They have to be put to death. So what if Hashem has done a victory? What's that got to do with anything? Why should that stop the people, the traitors, being put to death? Any ideas?
Well, he's more or less showing the qualities of kingship now, Saul, with a victory and now mercy.
Right. Okay, so this speaks nicely of Shaul again. So far, we haven't seen anything negative about Shaul, have we? Shaul has been modest. He has been kind. Even at the end of chapter 10, go back to chapter 10 again, the last pasuk that Paul just mentioned. These unscrupulous men were disparaging about him, and he kept his peace. He was mute. He remained silent. He didn't deal with it. And now, when he is in the ascendancy, and people are wanting to punish those that speak out against him, he's being magnanimous and says, "No, let nobody be put to death." Well, who does that remind you of, and what story does it remind you of? A previous leader of Israel who acted in the same way. Any ideas? We have discussed this particular story a few weeks ago, actually, in a different context. I'm referring to the story of Eldad and Medad. Remember the story with Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe comes down, the people are prophesying in the camp, and there are two guys, one's called Eldad, the other's called Medad, and they are prophesying in the camp, and Yehoshua says to Moshe Rabbeinu, "You've got to stop this." What were they saying? They were saying that Moshe is going to die, and Yehoshua is going to take over and lead the people into Israel. And Yehoshua himself said, what did he say to them, to Moshe? He says, "You've got to stop this. You've got to put them in prison. Lock them up. You can't have these people speaking badly about you, that you're going to die." No, it's terrible. And what does Moshe say? Moshe says, "Leave them alone. Leave them alone. They don't need to be put in prison. It's fine. I'm very happy for people to be prophesying." And he acts in a very magnanimous way. And this really is very reminiscent of that story. Shaul, the people say to Shmuel, right? The people say to Shmuel, "Vayoma ha'amel Shmuel," because Shmuel is still the Navi, he's still really effectively the leader. Shaul might have just shown himself to be the military leader, but this verse 12 tells us that in the eyes of the people, Shmuel is still the leader of the people. He might not be the military leader who has scored this stunning victory. He might not be the chief of staff or the defense minister, but he is still the boss, Shmuel, because the people said to Shmuel, "Bring over these people and let's put them to death." But Shaul steps in. Very interesting. Verse 12 says the people said to Shmuel, and who answers? Shaul answers. You see here, this is the first time that we see Shaul stepping up to be acting in a king-like fashion, because the people go to Shmuel with a request, and Shaul says no. Shaul steps in and says, "No man shall be put to death on this day." There are various other examples, actually, that shows us a principle that nobody is put to death on the day of a victory. And there are various other examples that you can see in Tanakh, where on the day of a victory nobody is put to death. And the first one we see here is here with Shaul, who says, "No man shall be put to death," because this is a great day of victory, of Hashem has delivered Israel, and we don't want it spoiling with people being put to death. Shmuel does not disagree, and what does he say? He takes this opportunity. Shmuel is a very clever leader, clever politician, as it were. And what does he say? Verse 14, Leon. You're muted, Leon.
Then Samuel said to the people, "Come and let us go to Gilgal, and let us renew the kingdom there." So all the people went to Gilgal, where they made Saul king before Hashem in Gilgal, and there they slaughtered peace offerings before Hashem. And there Saul, as well as all the men of Israel, rejoiced exceedingly.
Okay, so what's happened here is Shmuel has jumped in and has capitalized on the feel-good factor. That's what we'd call it today, isn't it? The feel-good factor of a victory against Ammon. Shaul has engineered this great victory against Ammon, and the Shmuel has said to the people, "Come on, let's renew the kingdom here. Let's use this opportunity of Shaul's very high popularity ratings at this point, and let's go and redo the coronation." Remember, the coronation that had been before was a bit of a wet squib, damp squib. I think that's the expression, isn't it? It was a bit of a damp squib. They wanted to crown it. They did this lottery business. They wanted to crown Shaul, and he wasn't even there. He was hiding amongst the baggage, if you remember the expression. And they had to schlep him out, and he sort of reluctantly accepted the coronation. And then let's go back to chapter 10 again. And then we had our pasuk, didn't we? There they had to find him, and then he went to his house with the people whose heart that God had touched. And then some people said, "Well, this guy, nah, how will he save us?" That's our last verse there. Those unscrupulous men, Bane Israel. But now in chapter 11, after the victory, have a look at the last pasuk of chapter 11 compared to the last verse of chapter 10. It's very different. Last verse of chapter 10 shows that there are people who do not accept Shaul and who have no truck with him at all and think that he's not the man for the job. Look at verse 15 again, please, Leon.
So all the people went to Gilgal, where they made Saul king before Hashem in Gilgal. And there they slaughtered peace offerings before Hashem. And there Saul, as well as all the men of Israel, rejoiced exceedingly.
Okay, so there are two standout words there in that verse. Vayelchu chol ha'am. All the people went. No dissenters this time. And it ends with Vayismach sham Shaul, and Shaul celebrated there v'chol anshe Yisrael ad ma'od, and all the men of Israel. So the contrast between the end of chapter 11 and the end of chapter 10 is very great. End of chapter 10, there are dissenting people in the country who don't accept Shaul as a king, think he's not up to the job. He gets a stunning victory by showing strength. Remember, he was the one that got the 330,000 people together. Remember, we spoke about this last week or the week before. Generally speaking, they would not have come to assist Yavesh Gilad for the simple reason that Yavesh Gilad did not go and help them, did not go and assist them in their battle against Binyamin after the episode of the concubine at Giv'ah. So it stands to reason that it was only because Shaul sent out these cut up oxen and said, if you don't come, this is what will happen to you. And he basically showed great strength. He then showed great military tactical awareness because he caught the Ammonites by surprise and smote them good and proper. So that those that remaining were so scattered that two of them weren't together. So he first of all demonstrated strength, then he demonstrated military nous, and then he demonstrated military ability by winning the battle and thoroughly winning the battle. And at this point, all the people now, there are no doubters, there are no dissenters. All the people go before Saul to Gilgal, and they made him the king, and they had a re-coronation ceremony, if you like. They did it again, and this time everybody accepted Shaul as the king. And that's where we get to today at the end of the chapter, the end of chapter 11. Shaul is on a high. He's now the fully accepted king of Israel. We don't see, interestingly, we don't see any mention of the separate Yehuda at this point. We will do later on, but at this point we don't see any separate Yehuda, and therefore it can be assumed that the men of Yehuda, as well as the men of Israel, also accepted Shaul as their king. So that's the end of chapter 11. Chapter 12 starts with basically the goodbye speech of Shmuel. Shmuel is about to take his leave now. Why does Shmuel now do this now? Because he now feels that he's able to go, because he's done his job. Remember, we said it on many, many occasions. The job of Shmuel was to be the bridge between anarchy in Sefer Shoftim to monarchy in Sefer Shmuel Aleph, where we are now. And now he has done that job. We've got to the point where Shaul is now the accepted king. We have a monarchy. We no longer have anarchy. Shmuel is now able to say, right, I now feel comfortable in taking my leave from you all, because I've now found the formula, I've found the successor, I've found the person who is going to take you forward. We've bridged that gap between anarchy and monarchy, and now I feel able to say my goodbyes. And we'll see that there's quite a lot of parallels here between Shmuel's final speech and Moshe Rabbeinu, and we'll talk about that next week when we start chapter 12. Any questions or comments on chapter 11 of Shmuel Aleph? Yes, Paul.
You mentioned before that there's other instances where they didn't kill anybody on the day of a victory. Can you elaborate a bit?
Yeah. Okay. So what we see here in okay, question number 1. 1 second, I'm just looking for my reference here. Chapter 14, verse 45. Let's have a look at that. Where are we? That's 18. Let's go back to chapter 14. Can't be that one, because it's not a 45. I don't know which book it's in. It must be in Shmuel Bet, maybe. There's a pasuk here, and we're talking about the story of Yehonatan, when Shaul wants to kill him. Shaul wants to kill him because he has broken the oath that was made. See if it's in Shmuel Bet. Hang on. No, it can't be that either. It must be Malachim Aleph then. I'll find it for you.
It is 1445 in Shmuel Aleph.
Oh, well, why did I not find it then?
Maybe you were looking at the wrong payroll.
Maybe.
Johnny.
Oh, there we go. Found it. There we go. Right. There we go. Right. So, Paul, here we go. So they had this business there where they had lots were drawn to see who had done this terrible act. And Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." And Jonathan said, "I tasted a bit of honey." They had a pact that nobody was going to eat until this victory had come. And Yehonatan, the son of Shaul, broke it, and so Shaul said, "So shall he continue, for you shall die, Jonathan. You've broken the oath, and you have to die." And the people said to Shaul, this is interesting because it's the other way around. Remember, in our chapter, Shaul is the one that says nobody's going to die on a day of victory. Look what it says in verse 45 here. Shall Jonathan, who has wrought this great salvation in Israel, die? Far be it. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. This day. Okay? And so they bring this as a proof. On the day of a great victory, nobody is put to death. The people say to Shaul in sort of irony, really, because it was that Shaul that said to the people initially that in our chapter. And there is another example as well in chapter 19. In chapter 19, after another victory against the Plishtim this time. Let's go to chapter 19 and have a look. Chapter 19, verse 5. Okay, here we go. And he put his life in his hand and slew the Philistine. We're talking about David. Here, this is where Shaul wants to kill David this time. And the Lord wrought a great salvation for all Israel. Same idea. This great salvation. You saw and you rejoiced. Why then should you sin against innocent blood to put David to death for no reason? And so this idea of a salvation preventing people being put to death seems to have quite a lot of examples. There's another example in Shmuel Bet, Shimi ben Gera, at the end of Avshalom's rebellion. There's another example in Shmuel Bet, if you want to look it up. It's chapter 19, verse 23. So there's a few examples here. The irony, of course, is that Shaul, of course, loses the plot, as we know. He starts off being this modest man, Tsanua, and doesn't want to put people to death. Unfortunately, as we'll see in the next few chapters, he loses the plot and he becomes paranoid, thinks everybody's out to get him, and it all unravels, as we will see in the next, starting in the next chapter, book 1, after Shmuel's thing. Yes,
Johnny. I just want to rectify something. I made a mistake about the number of of present day the Israeli army. They're about, the standing army is about 170,000, not 140, with a little over 100,000 conscripts. The rest are professionals, and there are another 465,000 reservists. So if we would have a total call up in case of existential threat, we'd have about 635,000 soldiers in the IDF.
Okay, so the numbers were your guess wasn't far off. It was a good guess.
It wasn't a guess. I got it wrong. I forgot. I checked it.
The point remains, and that is that the figures that we're talking about here are double the standing army of today. So that was the point that I wanted to make from that. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah. Isn't there another explanation for not putting all these people to death? Is that he was worried that maybe it would create a revolt in some other tribes by putting to death these people?
I would have thought, Michael, my initial comment to that is that I would have thought the opposite. Here was an opportunity to get rid of your detractors, of your enemies. You weren't even doing it. The people themselves wanted to get rid of these traitors, Maybe it was a stroke of political genius by Saul, because now they'd have them on their side. But if it was me, I think probably I would have said it's an opportunity to get rid of those people that could possibly topple me. So maybe it's a bluff or a double bluff. I don't know. But I think you could argue it both ways. Yeah, you could argue it both ways.
The Gemara cites this verse to Saul's discredit, that it showed his weakness, that he wasn't willing to put people to death who were Moreh B'Malchut.
Yeah, but not at this point, David. The Gemara quotes.
Yeah, no, at this point.
The Gemara quotes verse, the last pasuk of chapter 10, where he stays silent.
And it also quotes in a few lines on in the Gemara, it quotes this verse as well.
Ah, okay, fine. So it's all one episode. Okay, very good. All right. Any other comments or questions?
Johnny, could you remind us, if you've already said it, and I'm not sure whether you have, why the tribe of Manasseh got such a huge proportion, bigger in fact than Judah, when the land was divided up between the tribes?
I think it's a feature of the numbers, first of all, and in addition to that, they did Moshe Rabbeinu a favor, if you remember. Gad and Reuven wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan. And Moshe was worried that there would be a disconnect between them and the rest of the tribes. So he asked Manasseh to do that half of Manasseh should stay on the east, and the other half should go on the west, so that it would encourage connection between the east and the west, if you like. And therefore, as I suppose, a quid pro quo, Manasseh got a very nice portion, a big, large portion of land, as well as the numbers game as well. So I think it was partly as a result of them agreeing to Moshe's proposal.
Yeah.
Paul, you wanted to ask something?
Just an administrative question. Is this one-off going back to 10 o'clock, or is it from now on at 10 o'clock again?
No, it was just a one-off, because I had a meeting with Rav Yuval booked, which I needed to do. So yeah, no, just a one-off. Okay, Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua Tov. Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you, Johnny.
Shavua Tov. Thanks, Johnny.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting lesson. I mean, Shia, thank you.
Thanks for your input, Philip.
That's all right. And anything about army matters, I'm pretty good at.
Yes, I've appointed you our military correspondent.
Okay.